Good evening. It's great to see so many of you here for the William F. Buckley Jr. Program's first event of the fall semester. My name is Josh Altman, and I'm the student president of the Buckley Program. Before I introduce our guest for this evening, I'd like to express some gratitude to the Young America's Foundation, the Irving Brown Lecture Series, and Miss Carol Brown. The Buckley Program is dedicated to the promotion of intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. We at the Buckley Program have a strong belief that Yale would fail its principal mission of educating the leaders of tomorrow if it neglects to prepare students for the complexities that exist outside of the ivory tower. To put it more bluntly, if Yale students leave this institution thinking that leftism is gospel, that the right offers no solutions, and that interruption constitutes free speech, Yale has done a disservice to its students. To prevent the entrenchment of this phenomenon, which was first diagnosed by Bill Buckley over 50 years ago and got a man at Yale, the Buckley Program hosts lectures, debates, and conferences with guests who hold views that diverge from campus orthodoxy and challenge Yale students on their principles. As of last May, the Buckley Program boasted over 174 student fellows, and the topics of our events ran the gamut, from discussing the philosophical underpinnings of American conservatism to discussing the Obama administration's liberalization of relations with Cuba, and of course, to the perennial question, what is going on in American college campuses? For those of you who observed the events of last fall from afar, let me make this much clear. The Buckley Program stands firm in its commitment to protecting free speech on campus, and we will remind every single Yale student that prudent and reasonable people will disagree on how to resolve the complex issues at hand. To freshmen and upperclassmen who are interested in learning more about the Buckley Program, I recommend that you visit buckleyprogram.com to learn more about how to become a Buckley Program Fellow. And tonight we are kicking off a semester of stellar events with Mr. Ben Shapiro, and we will continue next Monday with a firing line debate on climate change policy with Mr. Jeremy Carl of the Hoover Institution and Professor William Nordhaus of Yale. And now to introduce our esteemed guest. A graduate of UCLA and Harvard Law School, Ben Shapiro is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire and the host of The Ben Shapiro Show. He founded Truth Revolt and is the author of 6 books, including, most recently, The People vs. Barack Obama, and the New York Times bestseller, Bullies, How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences America. Mr. Shapiro is a fierce critic of the BDS movement against Israel, and his current tour seeks to combat liberal illiberalism on college campuses. The Buckley Program is honored to be hosting him this evening, so without further ado, speaking on white privilege, multiculturalism, and other leftist myths, Mr. Ben Shapiro.
Well, thank you so much for having me. My mother will finally be pleased that I got to Yale. So first of all, thank you to Young America's Foundation. Brief note, if my voice seems to be going out, if I start hacking up a lung, it's just because I watched Hillary Clinton fall down on YouTube, and it's so contagious that alone seems to have affected me. Okay, so today, we're going to talk about all the dumb, stupid, nonsense words your professors and your administrators and students on this campus use to stifle debate and shut down opposition and excuse violence. So we're going to go through particularly, and we're going to debunk 5 of the most common campus terms that you hear all the time from the fascist left: diversity, white privilege, trigger warnings, microaggressions, and safe spaces. So the full hit list. Now, here's the warning. This exercise may make some people on the left a little upset. It may trigger some people. It may be construed as a microaggression. So there's your warning. If you don't like it, you can leave now. Facts tend to do that to people. And, you know, the good news is facts don't care about your feelings, as I'm fond of saying, and neither do I. So with that said, let's jump right in. So let's start with the first nonsense term the left likes to use, and that is diversity. So a few months back, I spoke at Cal State University, Los Angeles. A few days before I was scheduled to speak, the president of the university decided that it was imperative that my lecture be canceled. And he issued a letter explaining why he had canceled this lecture. He wrote, quote, "After careful consideration, I've decided that it will be best for our campus community if we reschedule Ben Shapiro's appearance for a later date so we can arrange for him to appear as part of a group of speakers with differing viewpoints on diversity. Such an event will better represent our university's dedication to the free exchange of ideas and the value of considering multiple viewpoints. So it's so important to consider multiple viewpoints and have a free exchange of ideas that the one idea they don't like has to be shut down in the name of diversity. And that's what diversity means. Diversity generally means on college campuses, shut up lest you make some people uncomfortable, because diversity can't thrive where people disagree. Everybody has to agree in order for diversity to really bloom. This idea goes back a long ways, back to a professor named Herbert Marcuse. He said back in the 1960s that he was in favor of what he called liberating tolerance as opposed to the repressive tolerance of free speech. He said free speech was just demonstration that there was this patriarchal, heteronormative order that crammed down freedom on people, and so freedom had to be overthrown. Free speech was repressive tolerance. What he wanted was liberating tolerance, and the only way to have liberating tolerance was to shut down everybody who disagreed with him. So true tolerance meant that you couldn't tolerate anybody who disagreed with him, which makes perfect sense if you're highly educated, but makes no sense if you have a basic shred of common sense. Marcuse's ideological grandchildren now run the campuses. So when I got to Cal State LA, a near riot broke out. The reason that I have security, I didn't have to have security a year ago when I did speeches, but because of all the security problems that we've had at my speeches in the past, I now have to have my friends in security. Students barricaded the doors, people pulled fire alarms, all in the name of diversity, all to show that this is what diversity was really about. And wasn't it just wonderful? Which begs the question, if the left doesn't care about diversity of thought, what exactly do they mean by diversity? Now, we all know what the left means by diversity. What the left means by, well, I haven't said anything bigoted yet, so you might want to wait. What the left means is racial diversity. But racial diversity, as we all know from being decent human beings, really shouldn't mean much. A racially diverse criminal gang isn't a better enterprise than an all-black church choir. Values matter significantly more than melanin level. And if you believe the opposite, this makes you a racist. Racial diversity doesn't mean anything. Decency means something. Diversity is not a bad thing, but it isn't a good thing unless the people who are racially diverse are also decent. Diversity isn't a bad thing unless the people who are racially diverse are indecent. This is not a difficult thing. Diversity isn't our strength. Decency is our strength. Robert Putnam is the author of a book called Bowling Alone, big New York Times bestseller. He's on the left, and he used to believe in this mantra, diversity is our strength. And then he started doing experiments regarding communities, and what he saw was that in diverse communities, racial, ethnic diversity, which these days comes along with diversity of fundamental values, thanks to the multicultural left, it didn't lead to better, more cohesive, and more tolerant communities. And again, this is Robert Putnam, who's on the left. He wrote this. He said, the only two things that go up as diversity of your census tract goes up are protest marches and television watching. He concluded that the only way that you could actually create social capital, and social capital, of course, is the thing that allows you to leave your door unlocked at night and allows your neighbor to babysit your kids. The only thing that leads to that is decency, shared values. The only thing that allows people of diverse backgrounds not to be polarized by tribal identity, to live together and to overcome their tribalism, is decent behavior. But unfortunately, the left only cares about racial diversity. That's all they care about. It's a racist philosophy, and they make themselves feel good by saying they stand for racial diversity rather than values. No objective standard of behavior, just the level of the melanin in your skin is what counts, or the country that you came from, or the ethnicity of your parents. Which means that, for example, at this university, the Yale Dramatic Association Board holds new auditions for a play after people whine that a white woman was cast in a role normally played by a black man. It doesn't matter that the white woman was auditioning next to 9 people of color who auditioned. She won the part. The black people didn't. That meant that they had to redo the auditions. And the board said, quote, "We recognize the pain that this situation has caused, and that this new decision may come too late for some and may hurt others." It sounds like there's a murder plot or something. Still, we hope that reopening auditions will give the Yale community another opportunity to bring new and varied voices to the stage. Except, of course, for Sarah Chapin, the white woman who is thrown out of the role. She can go screw herself because she's a white woman who happened to beat out some people of color for this role. So she has to lose, they have to win, not because of merit, not because of standards, but because of the color of her skin. What underlies this notion that diversity of skin color ought to matter more than decency? Well, the left, basic leftist philosophy, believes in equality of outcome and what they like to call fairness. Not fairness of opportunity, meaning lack of government obstacles, fairness of outcome. Thomas Sowell calls this the quest for cosmic justice, the idea that you need a fair outcome. That's what guarantees equality. Real equality is fairness of outcome. Inequality means inequity. By that same token, if there are two people in a room and one person is rich and one person is poor, something bad has happened. Some inequity has taken place. And if it turns out that one group of people with one skin color doesn't do as well economically as another group of people with another skin color, the left believes fairness of outcome hasn't been achieved, which means that the people who are in the group that's underachieving economically, that group is victimized. The people in that group are victimized. They've been sinned against. The left believes that freedom and liberty in America, the philosophy of individualism, this is insufficient to guarantee equality. If it were sufficient, we'd all end up in the same place. At the end of our lives, we'd have the same amount of wealth, we'd have had the same amount of education, but we don't. And so the left believes inequality equals inequity, and they are the same thing. So, what's to blame for all of this inequality and inequity? And this brings us to our second disgusting term of art, white privilege. According to the left, if there's inequality of outcome, there must be some shadowy, evil white privilege out there in the ether that is quashing people of other colors. That white privilege is inherent in everything from capitalism to free speech. You can't escape it. It's like Casper the Friendly Ghost. You can't see it, but it's there. Any system that doesn't result in racial diversity must be the result of this evil, terrible white privilege that all people of color suffer under and all white people benefit from. So we have to tear down the system. We tear down white privilege. That's the solution. And this is a pretty seductive idea. It's a pretty flattering idea. The campus left simply gives people a feeling of virtue by counting them as members of a victimized identity group. If you're an underachieving black woman, it's not possible. It's just not possible that you're underachieving because you're not working hard enough or because you took the wrong classes or made the wrong decisions. You must be failing because the system hates you. If you're an underachieving gay Hispanic man, you must be failing because the system has been keeping you down. Now, by this logic, the true bad guys in the world are the white, heterosexual, cisgender males, of course. The system was built by those evil, white, heterosexual, cisgender males, the founding fathers, in order to keep everybody else down. They designed a governmental economic system to protect their own evil interests at the expense of minorities everywhere. And this white privilege extends to all areas of American life. It is inescapable. You're born into it so long as you are white. You're born with a heavy burden on your back that can never be alleviated if you are non-white. Now, there is good news. If you're starting to get depressed because you're a white, heterosexual, cisgender male in the audience, all 7 of you, if you're starting to get depressed about all this, there's good news. We can alleviate your burden of being a white, heterosexual, cisgender male, but only if you admit your guilt and make penance. So the process is easy. All you have to do is acknowledge that everything that you've done that's caused you to be successful is actually not a result of your decision-making or your parents' decision-making. It's a result of your privilege. It's a result of the fact that America is a deeply racist and evil place. The trial of the white, heterosexual, cisgender male is somewhat like a verbal Spanish Inquisition. If you admit your white privilege, you don't have to be accused of white privilege anymore. If you don't admit your white privilege, that's because you're a beneficiary of white privilege. So you confess, and you repent, and you beg mercy, and you whip yourself, and they actually have scourges for sale in the Yale student body office. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Now, before we go further, I want to add a quick caveat here. It's important to define our terms. It's true that black people and other minorities in the United States have suffered historic discrimination. Of course that's true. You'd have to be a fool, an idiot, or a liar not to acknowledge this. It's inarguably true. It's even true that some people are likely suffering from the effects of historic discrimination under Jim Crow, because it turns out that how your parents grew up has impacts on the amount of wealth in which you grow up. But that does not mean that black people right now are suffering from today institutional discrimination. Historic discrimination is insufficient to explain current levels of inequality or to justify discrimination against white people who had nothing to do with Jim Crow. Individuals all over America have different backgrounds. We were all born with different skill sets. We were all born to different sets of parents. Some of us were born rich. Some of us were born poor. Some of us were born smart. Some of us were born slightly less smart. You're at Yale, right? Some people have histories of discrimination. Some people have histories of privilege. Some people were born in the hillbilly culture that J.D. Vance talks about in Hillbilly Elegy. Other people were born in an inner city culture. People are born with all sorts of different backgrounds. But the solution to historic injustice, the solution to how you were born, isn't to perpetrate injustice against other groups. 3 generations ago, my entire extended family was being slaughtered in Europe, and FDR shut the borders. Okay, that doesn't mean that now I get to come along and suggest that all modern American taxpayers have to pay me. That's not how this works. We can't fix where you start in life. There's just no way to do that. There's no way to fix where you start in life. That is beyond your control. It's beyond my control, and it's beyond government's control. Government doesn't have a time machine. It can't go back 150 years and fix everything that was wrong with slavery. Government doesn't have a time machine. It can't go back to the days of Jim Crow and fix everything that was going wrong in the days of Jim Crow. It's beyond your control, my control, and government's control. But the notion of white privilege suggests that no one can ever overcome this burden. You can't overcome where you started in life because there's this giant bear out there called white privilege that's trying to eat you. And even if you make the right decisions, this is what's so crippling about the white privilege discussion. Even if you make the right decisions in life, even if you do the right things, not the wrong things in life, you still won't succeed because there's this monster on your back called white privilege. And that is a lie. That is an absolute outright lie. In general, in America, the freest country ever conceived by man or implemented by his hands, okay, there's another reason that some people fail and some people succeed, because some people make better decisions than other people, and some values are better than other values. Perhaps equality of opportunity only exists so long as people are willing to take advantage of those opportunities. It turns out that's the truth. White privilege isn't reality. It's a cowardly way, a chicken way, to blame someone else for your failures to live up to decent, responsible standards. Whites are not born with a genetic predisposition to doing the right, responsible thing. They're not born into an arbitrary moral system that only benefits whites. There are 3 simple life rules, actually. If you want to avoid permanent poverty in the United States, according to the Brookings Institute, which is the left-leaning institute, you only have to do 3 things to avoid permanent poverty in the United States. Very simple. Graduate high school, get a job, don't have babies before you're married. That's it. You just do those 3 things, you will not be permanently poor in the United States of America. So here's the truth, okay? There is certain privilege, but it's what I like to call decision privilege. Certain decisions are going to privilege you and your children. You're going to have a better life if you pay attention to these things, and they're things that are in your control or in your control on behalf of your children. For example, it turns out the greatest privilege in American life is not white privilege. You want to talk about being born into privilege. The greatest privilege in American life is being born into a 2-parent family. And that's true for every race. This has nothing to do with race. For example, the poverty rate among 2-parent black families in the United States is 7%. 7. The poverty rate among single white mothers is 22%. What happened to white privilege? Why aren't those single white mothers doing better than the 2-parent black families? I mean, did they stop being white when they got knocked up or what? Okay, the fact is that if you have babies before you are married, you are more likely to be poor, and it is the single greatest predictor of intergenerational poverty. This is called decision privilege. Okay, here's another decision privilege. I like to call it the not committing crimes privilege. The higher criminality rate in the black community is not the result of some evil white system of skin privilege. It's the result of individuals being criminals. If you don't want to go to jail for murder, I have a quick and handy rule. Don't kill anyone. Here's the fact about that supposedly evil justice system, that evil racist justice system. It actually statistically under-prosecutes murder in minority communities because minority communities are under-policed. When the police do come into contact with black people to take the disgusting Black Lives Matter's lie, police are less likely statistically to kill black people than white people in the same circumstances, according to Professor Peter Moskos of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at CUNY. As early as 1994, the DOJ surveyed felony cases in the country's 75 largest urban areas and found lower felony prosecution rates for blacks than for whites. A deadly force lab study from Washington State University in the last couple of years found that participants were biased in favor of black suspects, not against them, in favor of them in simulated threat scenarios. In 2015, the DOJ analyzed the Philadelphia Police Department. They found that white officers were less likely than black or Hispanic officers to shoot unarmed black suspects. A widely publicized survey that just came out, a study that just came out from Harvard professor Roland Fryer in July 2016, surveyed over 1,000 police shootings and found that black suspects are shot significantly less often than white suspects in comparable situations. Fryer, for what it's worth, is black. In 2015, the cops shot 987 people. A huge majority of those people were armed or threatening deadly force. Blacks represented 26% of the people who were shot, even though blacks represent in the United States nearly 50% of all murder suspects. Police officers are 18.5 times more likely to be shot by a black male than an unarmed black male is likely to be killed by police. Okay, how about the white privilege of stop and frisk? You hear this one all the time, right? There's white privilege that tends to stop and frisk, driving while black. In New York City, minorities keep running into cops because minorities keep committing an outsized share of crimes. The stop and frisk fiasco in New York City, where Bill de Blasio, the moron mayor, thinks stop and frisk is evidence of racism. From January to June 2008, 98% of all gun assailants in New York City were Hispanic or black. Stop and frisk in that city statistically under-targeted minorities. Only 85% of the people stopped and frisked were Hispanic or black. If there's white privilege, if there is, it's in over-policing white communities. Black communities don't need fewer cops. They need more cops to stop the crime. That's exactly what Black Lives Matter will never allow, and more black people will die because of it. How about pulling people over for speeding, driving while black? The DOJ and the New Jersey Attorney General commissioned a study in the 1990s after the DOJ accused the New Jersey Highway Patrol of being biased against black folks. And what they found is that black people sped disproportionately. Blacks were 25% of all speeders. They were pulled over 23% of the time. How about sentencing disparities? You hear this one a lot too, and the one that people normally cite is the disparity between crack cocaine sentencing and powder cocaine sentencing. The idea being white people do powder and black people do crack, and therefore black people who go to prison for longer sentences because of crack, that's racism in the criminal justice system. This neglects a few things. 1, crack is more addictive than powder cocaine. 2, it's easier to distribute than powder cocaine. 3, the lead sponsor of all of the legislation with regard to crack cocaine and increased sentencing in the 1980s were black legislators from the inner cities who are sick of watching their cities become prey to the crack epidemic. If you want to compare white and black drug crime laws, then why not use solid substances like crystal meth? 80% of the people arrested for crystal meth charges are white. The sentences for crystal meth per ounce are exactly the same, identical to those for crack cocaine. By the way, the idea that the jails are filled with black and Hispanic people because of the war on drugs, it's not true. Just 16% of state prisoners were convicted for drug offenses. Most of the drug offenses involve distribution. Only 3.6% of state prisoners are in for simple drug possession, and that's typically not a guy in his dorm room smoking a bong. That's typically some guy who's out distributing and then pled down to a simple drug possession charge and ended up in jail. But all of this is white privilege. You can't explain any of these disparities with simple logic like I just did or with facts like I just did. It's all white privilege. It's just out there. It's the evil white guy. You can't point to the evil white guy, but it's the evil white guy. When Baltimore, when it riots, and it's largely black, and has a majority-minority police force, and a black police chief, and a black mayor, and a black city council, and a black president, and a black attorney general, when it burns itself up because a black guy gets killed by several police officers, several of whom are black, that's white privilege. And if we're going to be fair about privilege, if we're going to talk about the people who are really privileged in the United States, perhaps we ought to start with the Asians, the nefarious Asians, right? Because the fact is that the evil, terrible Asians have been schlonging us all, as Donald Trump might put it. Asians do better on standardized tests. They have to do better on standardized tests in order to get into college. A Princeton University study from a few years ago showed that blacks receive a bonus of 230 points on the SATs. This is back in the days when it was at a 1,600. Versus their competitors, Asians received a penalty of 50 points. And they deserve it, right? I mean, they really do. I mean, we really know that the founding Asians just created the documents and created the system specifically to just destroy the rest of us, which is why the Constitution is written in Korean. Now, as you might notice in all of this, accusing a racial group of privilege without evidence sounds an awful lot like horrible racism. But that's what the left constantly does. Fact-based perspectives, good decisions, these are not a privilege, these are decisions. And the impact of those decisions is predictable. When someone asks you to check your privilege, you should ask them to check their character. More likely than not, it is missing. White privilege is a way to divide, it's a way to silence. We can all agree discrimination is terrible. We can all stand together when a black person is wrongly shot by the police. But to attribute that shooting to unspecified white privilege and then state that America itself is racist, as Colin Kaepernick has done, is racist in and of itself. You can't assume that white people don't care about innocent black people getting shot without evidence. That is disgusting, and that is racist. Okay, let's move on to trigger warnings. And trigger warnings exist because if you can't achieve equality of outcome, and the left is focused very much on equality of outcome, then instead you want to focus on equality of feelings. We have to feel good about ourselves. Yay. Now, spoiler alert, I'm not big on feelings. If you're not a direct member of my family, then I frankly couldn't care less, and I don't think that you have to care about anybody else's feelings per se. I think facts are more important than feelings, of course. Trigger warnings reflect precisely the opposite point of view. A trigger warning says that if everybody has to feel equal, that means we have to warn people about things that are said that might offend them. We have to warn you that we're going to chat about politics. I have to warn you before I make this speech that you don't spontaneously combust like a character in a Dickens novel. We wouldn't want anybody to be triggered, because if people are triggered, then somehow they'll never recover from this strain and this shock and this stress. I mean, it's just like the members of the military who have to serve in Iraq and Afghanistan. I know that every time I meet a member of the military, the first thing that I do is I have to give them a bunch of trigger warnings because of all the suffering that's going to happen if I say things that are basically factual. It seems to me that if members of the military can deal with actually being shot at without trigger warnings, you should be able to deal with basic political speak without somebody warning you beforehand. The important point about trigger warnings, the basic notion of trigger warnings, is that nothing subjectively offensive must occur. Nothing subjective. It's not that it's objectively offensive, it's subjectively offensive. If you find it offensive, we have to give you a trigger warning beforehand. We have to tiptoe around you. We have to bend reality to fit you. Your perception of yourself is more important than objective reality. So, for example, if you're like me and you believe in basic human biology and you believe that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, but a man thinks he's a woman, the left says that you cannot, under any circumstances, certainly not without a trigger warning, say that a man is a man if he thinks he's a woman, right? Because otherwise you'll have triggered them and then something terrible will happen. And whenever the left says something terrible will happen, it's sort of like when you warn a small child that they're going to get in trouble, and the child is afraid of trouble, and they have no idea what trouble is. I don't know what the terrible thing that happens is if people are triggered. Does the world end? Do we all die? Does an asteroid hit us? Or are they just a little offended and then they wake up the next morning and they go do something useful with their life? So you issue the trigger, and the trigger warnings basically have to be issued for the third term of the fourth term of stupid art, which is microaggressions. So I know everybody's very into these microaggressions these days. Everybody's very concerned about microaggressions. These, of course, are little terms, little things that we say that may offend you, even if we don't mean to offend you. So intent is not necessary in order for a microaggression to have occurred. We have a strict liability standard. If someone is offended, you have microaggressed them. I hate the term microaggressions, not only because it's a foolish idea, but also because the term itself has embedded within it the idea that if I say something that offends you, it's not just something that offends you, it is an aggression. An aggression is to be met by aggression. Right? If I microaggress you, you get to punch me because I've microaggressed you now. You get to be aggressive in return. It's elevating verbiage to the level of violence, which, by the way, is what we would call colloquially the end of civilization. Civilization is about the idea that we get to say things without being met with violence. But microaggressions reject that notion. Microaggressions are an excuse for the fascist boot to come down and squash you. The word, as I say, and microaggressions, I mean, you all know this because you go to Yale, but if you're watching this online, you don't know what a microaggression is. If you use terms like he and she instead of words that don't exist that we're currently making up in a back room somewhere here, This is a microaggression. People have to be able to pick their own pronouns. Which, I mean, honestly, it sounds like a lot of fun to me. I've been watching a lot of Game of Thrones, so I prefer that all of you address me as Your Grace from here on in. If you say he and she, that's a microaggression. If you say things like, where are you from? That's a microaggression, which kills half of the pickup lines ever uttered. Right? If you say I'm colorblind, that's a microaggression because no one is colorblind. So if you say you hate racism, that's a microaggression because we're all racist. But if you say you're a racist, that's a macroaggression because you're not allowed to be racist. So good luck. The only commonality among all of these is that people find them offensive subjectively, not objectively. And then because you're mad, you get to reach out and hit somebody. And the way that you can tell this, when I spoke at Cal State LA, there was a professor who didn't like that I was there, and so he wrote on his door, he put up a whiteboard, and he wrote on there, the only real answer to microaggressions is macroaggressions. And unfortunately, this has bled up into the kind of leftist ether all throughout the United States. And we see it all the time. My favorite story about this is, of course, the CNN headline news story. How many of you have ever watched CNN headline news? This is a well-educated crowd, I would assume some. Show of hands, how many people have watched CNN headline news? Okay, that's the entire viewership of CNN headline news. Okay, so I was asked to go on CNN headline news. This would have been sometime last year. This is right around the time when Caitlyn Jenner was about to get the Hero of the Century Award from ESPN for the great heroic act of invading Normandy. No, I'm sorry. I mean for the great heroic act of having a couple of gender surgeries and some hormone treatment and being mentally ill. So they asked me to come on CNN headline news to discuss this because I'm the only conservative in a 30-mile radius of the CNN studios in LA. It's actually in the white pages. It just says conservative, and there's my name. I'm the only one. So they asked me, would you come on? And I said, sure. They get me in the green room, and they say, I think that you should know we have no ratings. And I said, don't worry, I'm well aware. And they said,